Welcome to episode 340 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent David Gates, who served in the FBI for 21 years. In this episode, he reviews two investigations involving sexual assaults committed on board airplanes. He also provides tips to identify and raise awareness of this safety issue on flights. David spent most of his bureau career assigned to the Los Angeles International Airport, also known as LAX. When he retired, he was considered one of the FBI's experts in crimes on board aircraft. Before joining the FBI, David Gates spent 7 years with the United States Customs Service at LAX. His first assignment was to the Los Angeles Division, and within a year of graduating from the FBI Academy, he was transferred to the offsite at LAX, which at the time was manned by 3 agents. He ended up spending 20 years at LAX with the FBI. Over those years, the squad grew to its current composition of a full task force with 12 agents and officers. In 2017, David was selected as the first ever supervisory special agent for the newly formed LAX squad. David has worked on hundreds of investigations involving crimes on board aircraft and federal crimes at airports. He's presented at over 100 conferences as a specialist in aviation crimes, including National Joint Terrorism Task Force, JTTF conferences, International Aviation Security Symposiums, and other law enforcement events. He is the recipient of 12 U.S. Attorney's Office Awards and multiple National Counterintelligence Awards for outstanding investigations, 2 FBI Medals of Excellence, and over 20 FBI citations for outstanding achievement. I am issuing a trigger warning for this episode because although descriptions are not graphic, we are reviewing incidents of sexual assault. David will be back on the show in early 2025 to talk about other crimes on board aircraft. I want to welcome new listeners. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to join my reader team where I talk about crime fiction, and you can learn all about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. There are also links for you to buy me a cup of coffee and discover my books, available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. My books make excellent holiday gifts. I'm just saying. Thank you for your support. Happy holidays. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent David Gates. Hey, David, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing great, Jerry. Thank you for having me.
Well, I have to tell you how I found out about you. I've been so lucky to have little relationships with people interested in joining the FBI. They allow me to tag along on their application journey. They go down to Quantico, and then they get assigned as brand new agents. And so one of those new agents, JL, assigned to the LA office, heard about you and immediately emailed me suggesting that I have you on the show. So thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a privilege for sure. And it's a little bit humbling that an agent reached out to you and asked to have me on. It was a long career and a good career. I retired a few months ago from the Los Angeles division. I've listened to a few of your episodes, and I've always really enjoyed hearing the stories from the people who have gone before me, because there's been some crazy things in the Bureau's history.
Yes, there has. And I think we're going to talk about some of those today. So I've already read your bio out loud to everyone listening, so they have an idea of your background. Looking over all of the things that you did at the Los Angeles International Airport, affectionately known as LAX, right?
Is it affectionately known as anything?
Okay, well, known as LAX, that you worked so many different violations, and we are going to probably end up doing 2 episodes to make sure that we adequately address both of those. But the work that you did with sexual assaults affected me the most because someone that I know has been very vocal about an incident that happened to her on an airplane. And I was moved by what happened to her. And I thought, well, this will be an opportunity to let people know about these incidents. And you are a leading expert in this area.
Well, that's a lot to live up to, but okay.
Well, before we go on, I think we need to establish or set the stage about the FBI's jurisdiction on incidents that happen on airplanes. So, why don't we start there?
Sure. You bring that up, and it's interesting how many times I would show up to a scene and introduce myself, and people's eyes would get wide, or they'd say, well, why is the FBI here for that? And I would explain that, number one, we have jurisdiction. There's federal law that says that if the doors of a plane are closed and it happens on the airplane, then the FBI leads the investigation. Think of it as special jurisdiction crimes. Special jurisdiction crimes include maritime law, which is 18 U.S.C. 7. It also includes Indian country, things that happen on reservations. That's a special jurisdiction of the United States. Aviation law is the same. It's special aircraft jurisdiction of the United States. And that's defined in Title 49 of the U.S. Code, Section 46501. And the FBI's specific jurisdiction is in Title 28 of the U.S. Code, Section 538. And that specific jurisdiction is it's like one sentence long. It says, the FBI shall investigate the following crimes. And it gives a whole bunch of sections, which is basically everything that happens on a plane. So 46501 is if it's a plane and it's in the United States or it lands in the United States, the FBI owns it. And in Title 28, these are all the things the FBI owns, which is all your assaults, all your sex assaults, thefts on a plane, indecent exposures, threats and violence. We've had people try to kick out windows of the plane or make bomb threats on board. You name it, it happens, right? If it happens on the ground, it pretty much happens on the air. But it is part of the special jurisdiction of the United States government.
All right, that's understandable. I know I did do a case review, episode 248, with Jennifer Koffendorfer. I don't know if you know her.
I know her a little bit.
Yeah, so she worked primarily out of the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, which is another large airport. And we did an episode about 32 razor blades on a plane with somebody who to see if they could be successful in trying to take razor blades on a plane. But for us, we're going to concentrate this particular episode just on sexual assaults. And then I'll have you come back and talk more about what you did at LAX. But that's for a future episode. Why don't we go ahead and get into what happens when a sexual assault occurs on a plane?
There are some exceptions, but generally, if the plane lands in the United States and the incident happened when the doors were closed, we own it. The FBI owns it. And that's not only for sexual assaults, that's for, when someone punches a flight attendant or steals your things. There's a little thing I like to say, and that is that 95% of crimes on board a plane are a violation of one of 3 kindergarten rules, things that we all learned when we were 5 years old. Number 1 is keep your hands to yourself. That's when you punch a passenger or a flight attendant, when you sexually assault someone, all those things about assaulting people. Keep your hands to yourself. Number 2 is don't steal things. There's more theft on planes than you might think. And number 3 is no one wants to see your wiener. And 95% of crimes aboard airplanes are violations of one of those 3 things. But today, as you mentioned, we're going to be talking about sexual misconduct or sexual assault on airplanes. And I worked at LAX for 20 years in the FBI, which is pretty rare. Most people bounce around. I stayed there the whole time. And before that, I was actually with U.S. Customs at LAX. So I was at LAX for most of the time between 1996 and 2024. And I saw a lot of stuff. And these sexual assaults and sexual misconducts, that's the jurisdictional aspect of today. And by the way, if the plane is on the ground in Beijing and the doors are closed and something happens and the pilot decides to take off and it lands at LAX or San Francisco, the FBI still has jurisdiction over what happened. Again, there's a couple of exceptions, like if it's an outbound international flight with a foreign flag carrier, that we may not have jurisdiction, but that's how we get involved. And by the way, there's about 500 agents in the FBI assigned to airports. Most of them are part-time assignments because a lot of airports don't have the level of incidents to have someone working there full-time. But the biggest airports in the country, what are called Cat X airports, Category X airports, those would be your LAs and your Atlantas, San Fran, JFK. They have people assigned full-time or entire squads. At LAX, we had, well, when I started at LAX in 2004, there were three of us, three agents. And when I retired, we had an entire squad made up of 12 people, 6 agents and 6 task force officers. And I had task force officers from the LAX Airport Police, the Los Angeles Police Department, Customs and Border Protection, and the Federal Air Marshal Service all working together to try to keep the skies safe and to enforce federal laws on planes. But beyond the jurisdiction, because there's not a crime on a plane every day, beyond jurisdiction for crimes on a plane, my squad stayed busy doing all those little things that we did to what I called further the mission of the FBI or help out Team America. Those are helping a local police department catch a fugitive or serve a subpoena for a squad out in Chicago or make an arrest for someone fleeing the country or tracking a fugitive or finding their travel, executing a search warrant, conducting a surveillance to see who dropped someone at the airport or who picked them up. There's all these things that kept us busy all day long. So being at an airport was more than just waiting for someone to act up on a plane. It was what I called the work of the Bureau. And every day there was the work of the Bureau to get done to move someone's case a little bit further or to help out our federal or state or local partners with their investigations.
The airport RA, or resident agency, was like a mini office doing all kinds of work and assisting with violations that could touch many, many cases.
I worked on just about everything over the course of the career. It's funny that you mentioned as an RA. We operated as an RA, but we were technically an offsite. My squad was a counterterrorism squad, and that really stems from 9/11 and airports being involved in 9/11. But in reality, I was the only counterterrorism supervisor with no counterterrorism cases, but about 40 to 50 criminal cases going on at any one time.
Well, like I had mentioned before, there are so many things that we could talk about that you were involved in over this 20 years plus that you were at the airport. I'm going to call this episode The FBI at LAX. This one is specifically going to be about sexual assault.
I want to put out for your listeners that, yeah, we're going to be talking about this, and you know someone who's personally been a victim. This is sort of like winning the negative lottery. This is not something that happens in every flight. I estimate it's probably about 1 in a million. But being assigned to somewhere like LAX, where there's 80 million people going through, you see it almost every week. But for the general traveling public, it's something that it's sort of like winning the lottery in terms of how frequently or infrequently it happens. So I don't want your listeners to think that every time you're on a plane, someone's going to do this to you. But I do want people to be aware that it happens. And hopefully after we do a case study or two, I can talk about some of the things to look for and how to not be a victim.
Oh, that is absolutely excellent. So thank you for that.
So when I was a young agent in my career, the sexual assault callouts were pretty rare. I mean, we would go months without a single call out, and I'd probably get 3 to 4 a year. And these are the early years, 2004 to 2008 or so. And just to set the stage for you, I think everyone on listening to this podcast has probably seen a YouTube video or something on the news where someone freaks out in an airplane and punches someone, or there's a brawl and everyone gets involved and tackles the person. We've all seen those videos. The thing with the sexual assaults on a plane are that usually they're very quiet incidents. There's no video. No one knows what's going on. A lot of times it's a darkened plane. It's not like people are screaming and taking pictures. So just finding the evidence to prosecute one of these cases is extremely difficult. It's a different type of case than what so many people are used to seeing on the nightly news or on their YouTube feed. So these are very important cases. This was one of the things that when we had a call out for something like this, where there was a sexual misconduct call out, this was a quote unquote must go. Sometimes we'd get a call and I'll give you more information before I decide to show up, that type of thing, if it's after hours. If there was a sexual assault call, I told my team, I want you there. This is too important to the victim. It's too important to what we do. We needed to be there and do the absolute best job we could every single time. Because so many of these, there's not enough evidence to pursue because it's a he said, she said, or he said, whatever the case may be. And there's no additional witnesses because, again, it is a darkened plane or it's a red eye or it happened under a blanket. But they're still important to do the best we can because a lot of them, we actually did get enough evidence to pursue one way or the other for criminal charges. And today we're going to talk about one or two of those. Early in my career, I actually had a loss. It was one of my very first cases where I conducted an investigation and I had enough evidence. I took it to the U.S. Attorney's Office. They agreed to prosecute. There was an indictment. We went to trial and the jury found in favor of the defendant, which doesn't happen every day, right? The U.S. Attorney's Office has a very good conviction rate, but we lost this one, and it was one of my first ones. And that put sort of a wet blanket over this for a long time. But eventually, we took a few more to trial and we won. And one of those is what I'm going to talk about today. It was the case of a guy named Marcelo de Jesus Maria. And by the way, one thing about Crimes on a Plane is that it's a 24/7 gig. Most airports shut down in the middle of the night, but LAX, for example, was pretty much busy from about 6 a.m. to about 1 a.m. And FBI agents are not necessarily present at the airport 24/7, but we always had someone on call. And this first case I'm going to tell you about, the case with Mr. De Jesus Maria, I was the duty agent on a Sunday, and it happened, it was probably about 9 or 9:30 p.m. when I got the call. And of course, I was at home with my family, and I dropped everything and put on my pants and my gear, and I raced up to LAX. I lived about 20 miles south of the airport, so it took me a little bit to get there. And in this particular case, they didn't call me until the plane had arrived. So when I showed up, it's a little bit of pandemonium where there's flight attendants and the suspect and the victim and a few passengers who've been detained who are angry because they want to leave. And it's just me. And again, it's late on a Sunday night. So what do you do? And on this particular evening, I knew that I couldn't interview 15 people and make everyone happy. And on this case, I pulled together all the flight attendants and I basically said, well, I should back up a little bit. It was a U.S. air flight, which no longer exists, U.S. air flight from Philadelphia to Los Angeles. And it was a male versus female near the back of the plane. And it was a sexual assault, a sexual misconduct call out. And the airport police had separated the suspect and the victim. And the flight attendants were all banded together and there were a few passengers waiting. And so I did my assessment and I said, well, even if I get enough evidence to make an arrest right now, it's going to be like 1 or 2 in the morning. It's going to be a problem. I think that I can probably hunt this guy down again if I can get enough evidence, but it might take me a little bit of time. So what I decided to do was I pulled the passengers together and I said, look, this is who I am. I know it's late. I know you don't want to be here. If you agree to answer my phone call tomorrow, I'll let you all go and I'll do a phone interview with you tomorrow. And they were more than eager to give me a name and a phone number and be on their merry way.
I can imagine.
Right. And by the way, they all ponied up later. Then I did the same thing with the flight attendants, but usually the flight attendants get on a bus together and they go off to a hotel. And I said, I need to interview one of you, probably the most directly involved, and get a good interview so I know at least what happened. And then after that, I'll do the same thing. I'll let you go. We'll do phone interviews. And they were thrilled. So I started off, well, before I did that, I went over to the victim and I introduced myself. And I said, hey, I need to do a couple interviews. I'm going to be back with you. Okay. Do you need anything? And we had a little talk and she was cool with it. And then I went over and I introduced myself to the suspect. And the suspect, as I was walking over, I noticed he had his hands behind him and he was like facing the corner, almost like someone had put him in a corner, like in a timeout. And I gave the officer like the little heads up, like, what was he doing? That the officer put him in that position. And the officer shrugged and he said, no, he did this on his own. I'm like, oh, okay. So I introduced myself to the suspect and I said, hey, it's going to take me a little bit of time, but I really wanted to get your side of the story. Please just give me a little bit of time. And he said, sure, no problem. I went ahead and I interviewed the flight attendant. I don't remember her name off the top of my head, but she had been in the back of the plane. And it was actually a really important interview. Sometimes the flight attendants don't see or hear anything. And she actually did not see the conduct that made this case what it was. But there were a couple tidbits that she had that ended up really making this case. And she was a long-term, long-serving flight attendant. She was assigned to the back of the plane, as I said. And as the flight pushed back from Philadelphia Airport, a man had jumped up from his seat, maybe 6 or 7 rows from the back of the plane, used the bathroom. And I know, and she had mentioned it, like, usually when the plane is starting to taxi, they don't have anyone get out of their seat. The seatbelt sign is on, but, he used the bathroom. And as he left the bathroom, he stopped at her jump seat and said, hey, would you mind if I changed seats so I could sit next to my wife? And the flight attendant told me that the airline's general policy is try to get people next to their families if possible. So she asked this guy, well, where's your wife sitting? And he pointed to the last row of the plane right next to them because they're in the back toilet area. She's right here. And the flight attendant said, sure, that's fine. And so the guy then, the suspect, tapped the woman on the shoulder and asked, can I sit here? And she said, yes. And he sat down next to her.
So the seat was empty.
Yeah, I should back up and tell you, this is the flight. When you board a plane, this flight had 3 seats on the left side, then an aisle, and then 3 seats on the right side. The woman was in the last row of the plane in the aisle seat. So if you're facing the cockpit, she would have been on the left side of the plane on the aisle seat. Make sense?
Yes.
The middle seat next to her was empty. And on the far left in the window seat, there was a male. So I guess I'm still talking from the flight attendant's point of view. She said, yeah, you can sit next to your wife. The seat's empty. That middle seat is empty. And he changed seats and sat next to her.
I take it we're going to learn very soon that that was not his wife.
Oh, it's going to get a lot worse than that. He was a priest.
Okay, now this has gotten really, really bizarre.
So anyway, he sits down and it's a normal flight. It's about a 5-hour flight or so, 4.5 to 5-hour flight from Philadelphia to Los Angeles. And about 2.5 to 3 hours in, the woman jumps up from her seat and uses the bathroom. And again, I'm still going from the flight attendant interview here. And while the woman is in the bathroom, she pushes the call button. There's a call button inside. And I can remember the flight attendant like sort of rolling her eyes and saying, yeah, a lot of times when that happens, it's because a woman needs a feminine product or something like that. So this flight attendant goes over and knocks on the door and asks if everything's okay. And the woman cracks the door open and she looks scared and concerned and says, yeah, this guy is touching me inappropriately. And the flight attendant is very confused because number one, it's not about a feminine product. And number two, she's like, what, you mean your husband? Because she thought it was, they were spouses. And this woman looks at you and says, I'm not married. And that's when the flight attendant knew that, we have a serious problem here. And the flight attendant called the other flight attendants back. They had a little conversation. And while they're talking about what to do, and by the way, the woman had stayed in the bathroom. She didn't leave the bathroom area. While the flight attendants were talking about what to do, the man, who's literally right there in the back of the plane too, because it's the last row, he stands up and says, hey, if you guys want, I can just move. And so they decided to put him all the way near the front of the plane in a middle seat between 2 male passengers. And there were no other issues for the rest of the flight. So she didn't see the contact, but she gave me a couple tidbits that were super important about the sitting next to your wife. Super important on that one, which we'll get to later. So after that, I interviewed the female, and she was a fashion model and very successful model. She was coming back from a vacation somewhere in the Bahamas, I believe, and she had taken a connecting flight from that part of the world up to Philadelphia, and then she was traveling home to Los Angeles. She lived in the greater Los Angeles area. So she had been on a plane a very long time that day and was super tired. And she talked about how she's in the last row of the plane And she's not that happy because if you're familiar with the last row of the plane, generally there's a bulkhead right behind that seat and they don't recline. So she's exhausted, but she's thinking the only saving grace here is that the middle seat is empty. So she could stretch out a little bit. And she talked about after the doors were closed and the plane pushed back, there was a guy a few rows ahead of her on the opposite side, so the right side of the plane, who kept turning around to stare at her. And it turned out to be our suspect. And she thought, what a creep, you know? And she told me this. And then she said that as the plane pushed back, she saw him leave his seat and walk toward her, staring at her. And she thought, oh, God, this is going to end badly. But then he walked right by her and used the toilet. And she thought, okay, I've dodged a bullet. But, a minute later, he comes back and taps her in the shoulder and asks, would you mind if I sat here? And she was under the impression that she couldn't say no, and she didn't own the seat. He can sit here if she wants. And so she reluctantly said, yeah, okay. And he sat next to her. And she said that for the rest of the flight, the two of them did not speak at all. There was no communication between the two of them. Plane takes off. It's a normal flight. Early on, she fell asleep because she was exhausted. And she could feel like bumping and stuff and nudging. And you know how it is in a plane. Even on a long flight, if you fall asleep, generally some turbulence or someone nudging you will wake you up. And this happened to her a couple times, and she didn't think anything of it because even though there was contact between her and the man now in the middle seat next to her, it was like a rubbing of the elbow or bumping of the legs, which happens on those very, very cramped airlines. She didn't think much of it. She didn't say anything. And eventually she went to sleep, but because she could not recline her seat, she put her tray table forward and she laid on her tray table. She put her arms out in front of her and laid on her arms on the tray table. And that's when things got bad because this was a late night flight. It's dark outside. It's dark in the cabin. And she woke up to find a hand on her inner thigh. She described it to me, and I always have them put a hand on their own thigh to show, well, was it near the knee? Was it on the top? She demonstrated inner thigh about maybe 2 inches from her vagina, which is pretty darn close, right? And she said that originally it was a firm contact and that she felt a hand reach across her around her back and cup her right breast and start to massage and squeeze her right breast. And, she's got her head on her tray table, horrified. And she said that the contact, well, originally she thought, well, maybe he's asleep. Maybe I should give him the benefit of the doubt. But as the pressing got intense and she couldn't escape him, she described it as aggressive. And it lasted for about 45 seconds where he was gripping her inner thigh and caressing her breast. She realized this is not an accident. Oh my God, what do I do? And she said that she couldn't escape at that moment because the contact was holding her in position so forcefully. It took about 45 seconds before she felt an easing of the contact. When she jumped up, she put her seatbelt up and she raced to the back of the plane, which is, again, only 1 row away. And that's when she went into the toilet area and she just stared at herself in the mirror for a little bit and was trying to calm down and trying to figure out, what should I do? And she decided to get a flight attendant involved by pushing the call attendant button, which is where the flight attendant's story sort of dovetailed into it. She stayed in the restroom while they moved the man forward, and then she went ahead and took her seat. I know that for the course of the flight attendants checked in on her, made sure she was okay. And then when it landed at LAX, airport police came on board and took her off the plane and took him off the plane and separated them by a bit, enough that there was still a line of sight because it's still an airport, but they weren't in contact anymore. So that was her story. And then by this time, the plane has landed. I call it the cast of thousands at the airport are there. You have airline representatives, airport police. There's people from the TSA. There's a TSA unit that investigates regulatory violations on planes. So they come out. There's airport operations. There's a few other groups that are all there. And they're all waiting for me to show up on Sunday night at between 9:30 and 10 p.m. now. So that's why I sort of assessed the situation, told everyone be ready for a phone call. And I did a couple of interviews, which is, again, the flight attendant and our victim. By this time, it's probably about midnight or so because the subject interview takes a while to get it done the right way. There's a lot of things to go over. And I eventually led our suspect to the FBI office, which at the time was maybe 100 yards from where the plane happened to land and block at Terminal 3. And once we were in the room, I was alone, so I had one of the officers be my second for the interview. And I recorded the interview with him. I gave him his advice of rights, which he signed the advice of rights and said he understood. And we started an interview with him, with Mr. De Jesus Maria. And it took, originally he didn't just come out and say, hey, I'm a priest. We started off with what do you do? And he said he worked for a charity. And the charity flew him around the country speaking at different churches to try to raise money for it. It was a Catholic charity, and it's like, it's very noble work of you and things like that. But the way he was describing like what he did, and he worked with, they moved him around. This is what I do, and this is where I work. He wasn't saying he was a priest, but it was becoming obvious he wanted me to sort of go there. And, I'm a trained investigator. So eventually I said, wait, are you a Catholic priest? And he said, yes, I am. And I said, well, how long have you been doing that? And he said about 10 years, but he didn't currently have a parish. So he was working for this aid organization, this charity. And the charity flew him 3 to 4 times a month, almost every Sunday, to different parishes to raise money, which is, again, very noble and everything. And on this trip, he had been out somewhere in the Philadelphia area. They had flown him out on Saturday. He spoke on Sunday. Then he's right back to Los Angeles, where he currently lived. He lived in the LA area also. So it was funny because after getting that out of him, you establish rapport in an interview, and then eventually you got to sort of cut to the chase. And the first question I asked him, hey, do you remember your assigned seat? And he described himself as being in an aisle seat near the back of the plane. And he said that almost immediately he was looking around trying to see if there was a better seat. And I'm thinking, well, why would he do that? He's in an aisle seat and there was no one in the middle seat next to him. So he had a seat.
That's the perfect seat. Yeah.
Exactly. And there was someone to his right that at the time he didn't really explain who it was, but it became relevant during trial. So anyway, he's looking around, and almost immediately, again, I've only asked, do you remember your assigned seat? And he says, I love women. I am attracted to women. And again, it's sort of like you, Jerry, ask 1 or 2 questions and I just start talking. He did the same thing. And I'm letting him go because, well, that's sort of where I'm going too. So keep talking about how you love women. And so he starts with that, and he's looking around for a better seat, and he sees this middle seat that's open behind him. And he said that he exchanges this look with this woman, and he decides, yeah, I'm going to sit there. And so you sort of know from the other stories that he uses the bathroom, then he asks her if he can switch seats, and he sits down next to her. Now, number one, he's taken a worse seat. He's gone from an aisle seat with nobody to a middle seat surrounded by 2 people. And it's the back seat of the airplane, which doesn't even recline. So it's one of the worst seats on the plane. But again, with his comments like, I love women, I'm attracted to women, I'm thinking of the elements of the crime and how he's helping me get to one of them.
Oh, absolutely. Because the only thing better about that seat is that there's a beautiful model that is
Right.
sitting next to him.
That's exactly correct. I mentioned the elements of the crime, and just to share with your listeners, the elements it's called abusive sexual contact. It's 18 USC 2244B on this one. It's basically that you have contact with a sexual area, and sexual area is defined in a different section of law, and that you intended to do it, that there was an intent aspect. Instead of just like inadvertently bumping someone's elbow, you were aiming for it and you were trying to arouse or humiliate, degrade, enjoy. There's a whole bunch of adjectives they use. So I basically have to prove that, number one, there was sexual contact, and number two, it was essentially on purpose. And so when he's talking about, I love women, I'm attracted to women, I'm thinking, well, I'm sort of halfway there, because any contact, because I've already talked to the victim, I know it was touched. I know he got inner thigh. I know he got breasts. And I know that from her description, it was not accidental contact. So I let him keep talking, and he talked about how he asked if he could sit next to her, he switched seats. And then it started to get a little bit creepy, if it already isn't creepy for you and your listeners. And he started to talk about how he was brushing up against her. His legs would touch hers, his arms would touch hers. And he said, this is a quote, "I have a weakness to flirt." And I'm like, oh boy. But as you know from your time in the FBI, one of the things we do is we build rapport. And even if we're a little bit horrified, we don't let on. We just nod and say, okay, I understand what you're saying. So he's telling me that he has a weakness to flirt and that he thinks the contact, the leg contact, and then a little bit of arm contact on the armrest and things like that, he interpreted that as her agreeing to this. And he told me that, hey, I think I went overboard in my flirting. I think my flirting was out of hands. So what you and I would consider incidental contact, and when the victim was describing that she would wake up to find like her legs are touching or him bumping her arm, he sees it as flirting where she's interested. She sees it as, this guy, and it's a small airplane seat. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. So it moved on from the bumping of the knees and the touching of the arm to him massaging, caressing her arm and shoulder with his hand. And eventually, and again, this is all with me asking, what was your assigned seat? He talked for several minutes. He went from, I love women, I'm attracted to them, I'm flirting, I went above and beyond my flirting, I started to massage her, and he eventually says, yeah, I was pretty close to her hip or her butt. I don't think it was her butt, but I was like on the top of her hip, and I was rubbing that. And a few times I rubbed my head against her shoulder. And finally, after all that, I got to my second question, So he talked for several minutes, but he said a lot in that time that led me to believe that, okay, we may have a problem here. And one of the things I asked was, well, what was she doing? Because you're telling me that you thought it was okay and that you thought that she was into you. What was she doing? And he's like, well, she didn't pull away. She didn't tell me to stop. So I thought it was okay. I thought she was into it. And he actually told the officers before I got there, because again, I interviewed the officers later too. He told the officers that, hey, I would have stopped if she had said something.
You don't know how much my anger is just, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, I know. And again, I'm listening to him with empathy and understanding, quote unquote understanding, because right now we're bros. We're two guys talking. And so he thinks he has a friend in me and he's telling me all these things, but I'm feeling like you are, which is, this is not acceptable behavior, period. And so then he says to me that, hey, look, this is a misunderstanding. And then he starts talking about consenting adults. I thought we were consenting adults. And so I'm asking him, well, what was she doing to consent? Did she give you permission? Did she say this is cool? And he says no words were exchanged. He said that after he asked if he could sit next to her, they didn't say a single word to each other. And I'm like, well, you don't necessarily have to say words for consent. Did she nod at you? Did she smile? Was she looking at you? And he's like, no, her eyes were closed. And I'm like, okay.
That's called sleeping. But
you think?
Oh my goodness.
So at one point, he told me that his touching of the knee to knee contact, touching the elbows, he said, well, I was testing my reactions. So he's testing her reactions to his touch. And she's basically adjusting in her seat, waking up for a minute. And to him, she's not saying no, she's not leaving, so it's cool. To her, it's, this guy is touching me, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because it's a small plane, and I'm going to adjust and go back to sleep. And over during my interview, I interviewed him for probably about an hour or so, he called his actions mutuality between consenting adults, which I thought was a little bit of a weird comment. And then he described his flirting as, quote, getting cozy, end quote. And to him, getting cozy and flirting was basically rubbing up against women on planes. And one of the things I did later on in the interview is I asked him, well, you fly 3 or 4 times a month. How often does this happen? And he said, well, it's not the first time this has happened. And he sort of looked for it. And he said he liked to get cozy on flights. And sometimes it was really good where there was this rubbing up against women. And he described it as, well, no words are exchanged, but it's just this, again, this mutuality where consenting adults are enjoying touching each other. I was a little bit horrified, and I was thinking, well, do we have like a serial sexual assaulter here? One of the things he said is that this was the furthest it's ever gone on a plane, which, everyone who's caught says that, but I was never able to track down other victims. So I don't know if it was as bad or not. This is pre Me Too. So not everyone reported incidents on planes at this time. My thought in the matter, my educated guess, is that there were probably plenty of people who thought he was creepy on planes who didn't say anything. It's just that in this case, the young lady said something and was horrified, and that he had gone a little bit further than he usually did, or so he said. But he kept calling his actions mutuality and getting cozy. And he said that when he put his arm around her back, he said, yeah, I did put my arm around her back and I was touching her thigh area. That's when she jumped up and went to the bathroom. And he said that, after she left, he saw flight attendants come from the front to the back and they were whispering. And that's when he knew that he was in trouble. So he said that I decided to get up and leave my seat and asked them if they'd like me to move. And they did. They put him between two guys. And at that point in the interview, I asked him, well, did you tell the flight attendant you wanted to sit next to your wife? And he was adamant. It's like, no, that is a lie. This is the hill he was going to die on. I would never say that. I'm a priest. That's ridiculous. And I even followed up. Well, could you have said something that was misconstrued about a wife or sitting next to someone you liked? He said, no, I just said nothing about a wife. That is an absolute lie. Okay, fine. And to get back to the touching women, to him, these flights where he brushed up against women, that was his idea of flirting. And I guess for a Catholic priest, that was his thing. And I asked him about her reaction. Well, did she ever say no? Did she ever say yes? And he said that her reaction was none, except to adjust in her seat. He thought she was trying to get comfortable. And then when she went forward to lay on the tray table, that's when he leaned to her. And he thought that when she laid forward like that and put her arms above her head, that's when he thought she was open to him touching her. And I asked about, well, did you look at her face? I mean, he said that her eyes were closed, but most of the time he wasn't looking at her face. At one point I asked him, did you think she was asleep? And he said, well, maybe, but I didn't think she was fully asleep. And just to pause there, for everyone who's been on a plane who tries to sleep on a plane, we all know it's hard to sleep on a plane. You wake up to every little bump and jostle. So her reaction was, to me, very normal for a traveler. Trying to sleep, waking up, going back to sleep, waking up. Very, very normal. And later on, I asked him, well, considering everything that's happened, what do you think about your theory now that she liked having you touch her, considering you're being interviewed by the FBI in a small room here at the airport? And he's like, well, I think it was a mistake to be so flirty, and maybe I overextended. But then he's like, but remember, I do have a strong attraction to women, and there are times when women like this, like it when I get flirty, which I was pretty much horrified for.
Yeah, it sounds like he's saying he couldn't help himself.
Well, it was funny, Jerry, because during this interview, I had the opportunity to tell a Catholic priest that confession was good for the soul. And when I said that, he looked me straight in the eyes and nodded. And then he went on to tell me a couple of lies, but that's another story. At this point, there's a few things I'm going to talk about later, which I call I may as well talk about them now. When you do so many of these over the course of years, you hear very similar parts and aspects of a story. I call it baking a cake. When you're doing a sex assault investigation, sort of like a cake, you have the same basic ingredients. There's flour and eggs and maybe some milk, but then there's different ingredients to change it from a chocolate cake to a pound cake to a whatever type of cake you're making. But you have these similarities between stories over the course of years and suspect pools. And so I started to ask those questions. And one of those questions is, were the armrests between you up or down? And he said, they were up. And I said, well, on both sides? Like, yeah, when I sat down in the seat, both armrests were up. And he told me that he put the armrest between him And the man to his left in the window seat, he put that armrest down, but he kept the armrest between him and the young lady up. And I asked why? Why not put them both down? Because putting them both down sort of defines this is your seat and this is my area, right? And he said, well, because I wanted to flirt a little bit. Well, okay. So one of the questions we always ask is about the armrest, because we see consistently people putting armrests up for easier access to whoever they're trying to touch. So what he said was very telling to me. I asked about the lighting in the plane because outside it's dark. It's a late night flight. And he said, yes, it was dark. The lights inside the plane were off. There's always running lights on the floor. A few people have lights on above, but overall it was darker on the plane than lighter, which is pretty normal when we're doing one of these investigations. A few other questions that different parts of the cake often will ask about blankets or jackets that are covering over you. But all those questions were asked. So a couple of my cake ingredients are there. It's a dark plane. People aren't paying attention because they're asleep. Because I asked that, well, what were the people doing? He's like, well, they're asleep or watching a movie. They're not paying attention to me. And the flight attendants, they're doing their rounds, but they're not walking by and looking at everyone for a 5-hour flight. Once they've done their service, they're sort of back in the back or at the front. They're not paying a lot of attention. So I guess the next step on that is I've done this interview. I've interviewed the three of them. I know I've got a pretty good case here, but at the same time, it's now about 1:30 to 2 in the morning. And I know that I've got a bunch of passengers to interview. I know I've got a bunch of flight attendants to interview. And based on my interview with him, I know I have other people, because not only do I have the people who he was originally sitting next to, the person to his left, for example, the person or the people in the row in front of him, he also got moved to the front of the plane. It was row 8. So I'm curious to talk to those people. Did he say anything? What did he do? So I know there's people I still need to track down to make my case, because right now I mostly have a he said, she said. She says he touched me. He says, oh, by the way, I should add, he absolutely denied touching her breast. He said, no, I did not touch her breast. I did not massage her breast. I touched her shoulder only. I was reaching around her and I was touching her shoulder. I'm like, okay. So again, he said, she said, but I did have enough evidence.
Did he admit to touching her upper thigh?
He admitted to touching her leg and her thigh, but he didn't admit getting that close to her vagina. So at this point, what I am looking at is, well, can I prove beyond a reasonable doubt the sexual assault? I've got his statements, which get me pretty far there because I've got the intent and I've got him acknowledging contact, but the specific sexual areas of the body, the inner thigh, the butt, he says that, yeah, hip, maybe the butt. I'm close, right? But he denied the breast. I'm close to the elements of the crime, but I'm thinking, well, I have some work to do, but I definitely can prove a simple assault, which is 18 USC 113A5. And at some airports in the country, including at LAX, we had the power and the ability, it was basically an agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office and a few others, to give people citations for misdemeanor crimes. So I basically wrote him a simple citation, a citation that day for simple assault for touching her, because he admitted to touching her without her permission. And she's like, yeah, I didn't give him permission. So I wrote him a ticket. So I knew he was going to be in court in about 2 months. I knew where he was going to be. I knew when he was going to be there. And I told him, look, I'm going to give you the citation now, and I'm going to keep working on this. And I'm not saying you're out of the woods, because we might go forward on this. We might have more for a felony. I just don't know. But, here's your citation. I'll see you in a couple months in federal court in Los Angeles. And I used those 2 months to do all the interviews I needed to do and to talk to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And by the time he came to court, we had enough to indict him for the felony abuse of sexual contact. So at this point, I let him go. It's 2 a.m. When I got to work the next morning, I told my team what had happened. I told my team what I needed in terms of help. We had flight attendants to interview. We had passengers to track down. We also needed to learn where some of the passengers had been sitting, the ones who had not stayed, because generally when something like this happens, we want to talk to the people in the row where it happened, the people across the row, the people behind. In this case, it didn't matter. There was no one behind. The people in front, because you never know what someone has heard or seen. I also wanted to talk to the people sitting next to him when he was moved to figure out what he said, what he did. Was there any consciousness of guilt? those types of things. So my team helped me out, got busy. We did a bunch of interviews. And the interview that really sealed the deal, I had to subpoena the airline to find out who was sitting in the back row across from where this happened. And it took about a week to get those results. And I ended up making a phone call to a man and a woman. I didn't know they were a couple at the time, different last names and everything. And I called them out of the blue and I'm like, this is who I am. You were on a flight. So just to make sure, like, this is my bona fides. I am who I say I am. I don't want anything from you. I don't want your credit card. You were on this flight this time, right? Like, yes. I said, you were sitting next to this other person. And it turns out the other person was in the car and they were on speakerphone, which I didn't know. And we don't like to do interviews like that together, but I'm sitting there with them. So I decided to go ahead and do it. And I asked the guy, I was like, look, did you see anything across the aisle? I was like, no, we were pretty much asleep. And I said, well, did you hear anything unusual? Anything unusual happen on the flight? And out of the blue, the guy says to me, it was weird because right at the start of the flight, before we even got in the air, a guy left his seat and he asked the flight attendant if he could sit next to his wife. And if you'll recall, the flight attendant said that, but our suspect absolutely denied it. He said, that's a lie. I never said it. And when you're doing a he said, she said investigation, if you can prove someone's a liar, it really helps the case. So that became extremely important evidence for our case, that we now could prove that our suspect lied about it and he did this on purpose. And I also talked to the people that were in row 8. It was interesting there because one of the young men was an actor, and he has gone on to do some pretty good acting jobs. At the time, he was sort of an up and coming, and now he's been the star of several shows. And he also testified in trial. And we asked, what did you see? What did you hear? What did this guy do? And he said, well, the guy just sat there and he prayed the entire rest of the flight. And so there's like, well, is he praying because he knows what he just did and he's in trouble? Or is he praying because he's a priest and that's what he does? I wasn't sure. So I really couldn't use that much. But at the end of the day, with the evidence we had, we went ahead and presented it to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And the U.S. Attorney's Office decided to charge him with the felony sexual misconduct. It's abusive sexual contact. And even there, I can remember when I got a phone call from 2 AUSAs. Their names are Jeff and Devin. Extremely competent, excellent AUSAs. I can remember that first phone call with them when they were telling me, yeah, we want to take this case. We think it's a good case. And I was the one pushing against it, saying, these are hard. It's like, even if we have this other evidence, I don't know if we can prove it. I don't know. Are you sure?
And that's because you were burnt before and you took on one and you lost it. You were kind of
exactly
gun
correct.
shy.
Yeah, absolutely. But it was their confidence and their insistence that we take this case. And I said, look, if you are in, I'm in. I'll do it. And I had one of my partners join me, and we ended up getting ready for trial. And trial was very, very hard. Oh, by the way, that first time I told you I wrote him a ticket and he showed up in court, it was about 6 or 8 weeks later. That night, he was just in regular civilian clothing, jeans and a t-shirt. He looked like anyone else. When he showed up in court for his misdemeanor, which we dropped, he was in full Catholic priest garb, regalia. He looked like a priest. And so, yeah, that was a thing. But eventually we charged him, we arrested him, we went to trial. And trial is never an easy thing, especially when you have a case like this, which is mostly he said, she said, and you have a person in a position of trust in society. And I know that from our perspective, well, the Catholic priests have sort of taken a hit over the course of years, but generally this is a person who has a lot of trust in society and is respected. So it was not an easy case. And the first trial ended up hanging. We did not get a conviction. And polling the jury, it turned out there was a holdout. But at the end of the day, we did not get the conviction. And the AUSAs wanted to retry it. And we had a talk with our victim because trial was not easy for her. One of the things that had come out before trial that we disclosed because, discovery rules, we have to, is that maybe pushing back a little bit, we're talking about he said, she said things. And one of the things she had done is that she had texted some people about what had happened. And she had said a couple things in her text messages that weren't accurate either. So we have the priest lying about him not wanting to sit next to his wife. And we have her basically telling her friends, yeah, this guy touched me and I pushed him away and I told him, don't do that. In reality, she had just jumped over her seat and ran away. So it wasn't something that was insurmountable, but it wasn't accurate. And when you're talking about a he said, she said, these are things that matter, right? I should point out one thing, and that is that I've done a lot of these cases over the years. And generally at this point, a lot of people tell me, well, if this had happened to me, I would have jumped up, I would have punched him, I would have screamed. And invariably I tell them, you probably wouldn't have. You have no idea how many strong, successful women I've talked to who tell me that. But when the chips are down and you're in a situation like this, most of them are stunned. They're in shock. They think it might be an accident. They don't know what to do. And remember, it's a quiet, dark plane. And they think that if they jump up and scream, they're going to be looked out as the crazy one. So there's only been 2 or 3 times out of the so many of these that I've investigated where someone has jumped up and screamed or hit somebody. It's very, very rare. Most people don't know how to react. And in this case, the victim's reaction was very much normal, which is, I don't know what to do. Oh my God, this is happening. And eventually find the courage to leave her seat and tell somebody. That is the most common thing that happens. So anyway, trial was difficult. We went back to her and said, we are willing to retry it. We know it was difficult. What do you want to do? We will do whatever you want to do. And she thought about it and said, I want to retry it. I want to go forward. And the second trial was maybe 2 months later. It was pretty fast. And we got the conviction. And by the way, during trial, he took the stand and he said some crazy stuff. The interview I did with him was recorded. And so part of that came in. And he was saying some stuff about, yeah, I only changed seats because there was a boy sitting in my row in the window seat. And I've been told not to sit next to boys. So I just decided to move.
Oh, that doesn't sound very good.
Yeah. Jeff, who was the AUSA who did the cross-examination, pretty much had a field day with him. I had been kicked out of the proceedings because the defense made a motion to the judge to have all witnesses be excluded. So I had to sit in the witness room of my own trial. I was driving with my partner to and from court every day. She could not tell me what was going on except to say that, holy cow, when I can tell you what happened, you aren't going to believe this. And so when it finally was over, she was telling me that the jury absolutely hated this guy and didn't believe him. And she's like, yeah, one of the jurors rolling her eyes, another was shaking her head.
And what was the difference between the first set of jurors and what he testified about and the second set? I mean, why did one believe him and the other ones absolutely did not?
Well, it's hard because we aren't in the jury room, but of course there was polling that's going on and we get to interview some of the jurors later. And it turned out one of the jurors just was like dead set, I will not be convicting, period. And we learned later that the jurors tried to get her removed, but there wasn't a cause to remove her. So I guess most of the jurors thought that the other person was being unreasonable and the evidence was pretty strong. A couple jurors mentioned during the polling afterward, like, yeah, we're sorry. Basically, 11 of them were pretty horrified from what I learned later. That was one of the reasons the USA has decided to ask for a retrial as long as the victim consented, was that they were pretty close on the first time. The second trial was pretty similar to the first trial. There wasn't any new evidence. I was on the stand for several hours in both. My cross-examination changed from 1 to 2. I was a little bit less combative. So that changed, but mostly the trial was the same both times. And the jury came back pretty quickly with a conviction. So that was helpful. It took 2 trials and 24 jurors, but we got the conviction out of him. The judge sentenced him to prison. That charge, by the way, doesn't have a massive prison sentence. It's like a 2-year maximum, believe it or not. The judge sentenced him to 6 months prison, 6 months home confinement, some probation afterwards, and he had to register as a sex offender. The attorneys were some pretty high-powered LA attorneys, very, very competent attorneys. He appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and that was handled by the public defender's office. The second he was found guilty, he had to resign from the priesthood And I believe, I don't know for sure, I believe the church probably paid for his high powered attorneys, and then the public defenders handled the appeal because he was no longer associated. The appeals issues really weren't about his conduct. They were some sort of arcane sections of law. Basically, one of them was that, hey, this happened over the Midwest somewhere, and you have to charge him there versus in LA where the plane landed. And there are a couple things like that. The appeals court ruled against him, and the case is over.
The second one is about a young woman who doesn't speak the language and is really confused and doesn't know what to do.
Yeah, I bring that one up because there's a lot of similarities, which goes back into my baking a cake analogy. And this was a guy named Juan Paul Price. So this was another weekend call out. That's sort of par for the course at an airport where nothing happens Tuesday at 11 a.m. It's always like the first one at 9 p.m. on a Sunday. This happened to be about 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. I happened to be at a soccer tournament for one of my children where I got the call out, and I was pretty far away, like an hour's drive away. So I texted my team and asked them if they could help. It was a flight from Japan to Los Angeles, so it was a very, very long haul flight. And in this case, you and your listeners will hear some similarities. Our suspect was on the right side of the plane, and he's looking back a few rows back at a young lady. And the young lady, Japanese female, was traveling with another friend of hers, another Japanese female. They're coming to the United States for vacation. And they were sitting in the two middle seats of the plane. They were originally sitting on the aisle seat and the middle seat, but they moved over to this plane had 4 seats in the middle section. It was a bigger plane. And they had moved over a seat because the video monitor did not work. And maybe I should put it in perspective for you. There's like 2 seats on the left side of the plane, 4 seats in the middle, then 2 seats on the right side of the plane. Our suspect is on the right side of the plane in an aisle seat, and he's looking over his shoulder back at these 2 young ladies. And he sees the 2 young ladies switch from the aisle and middle to the 2 middle seats, leaving that aisle seat empty. And early on in the flight, he decides to use the bathroom and then asks the young ladies if he can sit there, which he does. And he asked the flight attendant too, hey, can I sit there? And the flight attendant said, well, that seat is now empty because the video screen doesn't work. And so it's basically sort of like the priest case. This is one of the worst seats on the plane. You're on an 11-hour flight and the video screen doesn't work. Why would you want to sit there? And his argument to me was, when I interviewed him, was, well, there was like this box under my seat, like for the video system. So I didn't have a lot of leg room. So he ends up early in the flight moving back about 2 or 3 rows and sitting next to these 2 Japanese girls. His background was he was in his mid-40s, and he had been teaching English in, I believe, the Philippines and Vietnam, and he was flying back home. So he sits next to them, and he tries to have a conversation with the woman to his left, a young lady. I think she was early 20s, and he realizes very quickly he really can't communicate because she doesn't speak a lot of English, like almost no English. She offered him some wine, though, and he accepted. And then he ordered wine and he offered her some of his, and they shared wine. And to him, that was his in. And at one point early on, the flight attendant slipped the Japanese companion a note. And the flight attendant said, like, watch out for this guy. I think something's wrong here. And the flight attendant slipped her a note because of, why would he switch to a lousy seat to sit next to this young lady? The flight attendant thought this guy might be a predator. The friend thought, well, he probably means this guy's going to try to steal our stuff. So they both put like their wallets in a different location so he couldn't steal their wallets. In reality, that wasn't it at all. Again, it's a dark plane. It's dark outside. Most people are sleeping. He fell asleep for a little bit and he woke up, because we wake up on planes due to turbulence and things like that. And he woke up to find that her hand was touching his hand. And not like you and I are thinking like it's a full handhold, but there's just contact there because, again, they're big planes, but they're small seats, and there's normal incidental contact. So he woke up to find there's contact between him and her. And so he starts to rub her hand. And then he described to me, and by the way, I should probably back up. It took me a while to get there. What I'm learning from him was during, again, a recorded interview that happened after his advisor rights or his Miranda rights were given. So this is what he's telling me. I should probably back up again, too. I had two of my partners here for this one. One of them was new to my office, and one of them had been with me for a long time. They had interviewed the Japanese women one at a time with a translator while waiting for me to get there. One of my partners was 8 months pregnant, so I sent her home, and I took my other partner in as my second for the interview. And she had only been with me for maybe a month at that time, so she didn't really know all the ins and outs at that point about these types of cases. She took notes and was in the back of the room for the interview, so she was out of line of sight, but I could see her. And during my interview with our suspect, with Mr. Price, I could see her several times. Her jaw just drop or her eyes get wide, and very much not a poker face. Fortunately, he didn't see it, but some of the things he said were just bonkers, which I'll go into now. So during my interview, again, post Miranda recorded interview, he's talking about, I switched seats and we shared this wine. It's a dark plane, and now she's touching me. And he's telling me, I thought she liked it. And again, I'm asking, well, did she say she wanted it? And he's like, no, she doesn't even speak English. And was she giving you like a smile or a nod? Did you look at her? And he's like, yeah, I looked at her, and her eyes would open, then they would close. You're hearing the similarities, hopefully.
Yes, it's called sleeping.
It is called sleeping. Thank you. And then he tells me, I looked around the plane to make sure no one was watching. And I'm like, well, that's consciousness of guilt in my mind. If you're doing nothing wrong, why do you even care if anyone's watching you? So he starts with rubbing the arm and rubbing the full arm. Oh, one of the other things he said is when I asked him, well, why would you move to a seat where the video monitor doesn't work? And he's like, I wasn't interested in watching a video. It became telling because he was interested in the young ladies, right? But he's telling me that as he's rubbing her arm and her hand, he's thinking to himself, and this is again during the interview, he's like, hey, this is sort of cool. And he told me that he rubbed her arm and hand for about 10 minutes. And I said, well, then what did you do? He said, then I started to touch her all over. It was a decent interview. I'm like, well, describe all over. He told me he touched her breasts and her chest. I'm asking, well, was she looking at you? What signs were you getting that she liked this? And he's telling me that she didn't say anything, and I wasn't looking at her at this point. I'm more focused on what I was touching. And he also said that he covered her with the airline blanket. She had a blanket on, and he had a blanket, and he covered both of them with the blanket. And the blanket or a jacket is one of those cake ingredients I'm always looking for, where you're hiding your actions. In this case, not only did she have a blanket, he put a blanket over the two of them so his arms couldn't be seen by anyone walking up and down the aisle. And he was telling me that when he turned toward her and tried to kiss her, and I guess he turned her face to try to get her to kiss him, that's when he felt resistance. That's when she got up and left. By this time, I'm circling back to figure out, well, what exactly did you touch? At the end of the day, he was rubbing her breasts down her shirt skin to skin. He undid her pants, and he was complaining to me. By the way, he said the breasts were a few minutes. He unzipped her pants, and he was complaining to me that her pants were very tight, and it was hard to get his hand down there. And at one point, and this is when my partner gave me a look of horror, at one point I asked him, well, how far down did you get? Did you reach pubic hair? And he said, well, she was shaved. So I knew from that answer that he had gotten pretty darn far down. And he said that, I tried to touch her vagina, but her pants were just too tight. So again, my partner's horrified. I'm pretty horrified. But as you know from your time in the Bureau, we're establishing rapport. We're not expressing horror. We're just nodding. And he really thought that I was a bro. I was with him and understood. When in reality, what's going through my mind is, holy cow, I'm horrified. This guy is up to no good. And this is horrifying to me.
But again, you can't express that to him because your whole purpose is to get him to keep talking and to tell you everything, which of course he's not going to do if you show him that you think that his actions were horrible.
That's exactly correct. And that came up later. He was really mad at me through trial and afterwards. He really saw my interview with him as a betrayal, where in reality, I'm thinking I've done exactly what I'm supposed to do in my job to get him to say what he said. I feel pretty good about it, about the interview at least. He said that when she jumped up and left and ran to the back of the plane, that was when he realized that, maybe she didn't want this. And he wrote her a note. And the note was horrifying, by the way. It was a sticky note, and it said, if you don't want someone to touch you, you should say something. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that was the gist of it. And like, it was basically, to me, it was righteous indignation on his part that, how dare she not want to be touched and how dare she not say something? And to me, it really exemplified what was wrong with his behavior. I'm sorry, I think the actual note was, if you don't want a man to touch you, you need to learn to say no.
Whoa.
I'm guessing you and your listeners are probably horrified. And that's what I thought too. But I also thought this is really good evidence for me because remember, this was an international flight. Customs had searched him and his belongings before I even got there. And they had found the note, which I then seized as evidence. And that became a trial exhibit to show that not only did he touch her, but the note really shows that he didn't have permission to touch her when he did it. And it also really put him in a bad light because it really is the wrong attitude that he's the attitude that I can do whatever I want as long as someone doesn't tell me no in advance. One of the things that I asked was, well, is it her job to say no, or is it your job not to touch her? And he told me, well, from now on, this is a good life lesson. And one of the things I said to him was, well, you're a man in your 40s. This is a lesson you should have already learned. And that, by the way, when he ended up appealing to the Ninth Circuit quoted that line and said, yeah, he should have already known that lesson. This was a very similar type of case where we had a lot of interviews to do, which we did. We got a lot of evidence. We ended up going to trial, and he was convicted mostly on the strength of the interview and his note. He was convicted of abuse of sexual contact, which is a felony. And by the way, we flew the victim back in from Japan. The federal government, has a lot of money to pay for trials. We really felt it was important on this one to spend the money and get people here. We thought this was an important case. I know that the sentencing guidelines were a little bit on the light side, but this is unacceptable behavior, and it really affects people's lives. And that's one of the things I should bring up is that, we have victim services, both the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI, and getting people help to get through this is super important. And we made sure that we had those resources in place. It was a little bit harder for this young lady because she was in Japan, which meant we had to go through our legal attaché in Tokyo and the local police, but it was still important for us to do. So we went to trial. We ended up winning the trial. The judge, in my opinion, I have to give an opinion here, we were happy with the outcome of the guilty verdict, but he was not sentenced to prison. He was given a probation sentence along with registering as a sex offender, which really disappointed us.
Yeah, especially due to the age and the fact that these girls didn't speak English. I mean, he really took advantage of the situation.
He really did. But at the end of the day, it's our job to investigate, and it's someone else's job to prosecute and someone else's job to judge. So you roll with the punches and you move on. We got the conviction. He appealed to the Ninth Circuit and lost. He appealed to the Supreme Court, and he was not heard by the Supreme Court. So the case was officially over. Maybe about 4 years ago, I got a random email from him. In the email, he basically talked about how his probation officer thought it would be a good idea for him to email me and get some closure. But the tone of the email was condescending, and it really showed me he had learned nothing and that he really blamed me and that he didn't think he had done anything wrong. I didn't even finish reading the entire email. I just put it in the case file and I told the AUSA and my partner, who's still in the FBI, so I won't name her, I told them about it and told them how disgusted I was that even after being convicted and years later, he still didn't think he had done anything wrong. And which in reality, he had been very, very wrong. So those are the two stories.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing those with us because it is going to help us understand what to do in those situations. I know that people are going to say, well, speak up, but you're in a small space with somebody who has almost got you confined and it's dark and you're scared and you may be coming in and out of sleep and you're not sure what's happening and there's just so many questions in your mind as to what to do. So I have two questions for you. First of all, did you see any changes? You mentioned this yourself, and people coming forward before and after the Me Too movement. And then, of course, what are your tips as to what should be done when you become a victim of this or you witness what you think is someone being victimized?
I could not believe the difference in reports in the post Me Too era. We would go from 3 or 4 allegations a year in the post Me Too movement, monthly or sometimes weekly. It was just insane how many extra reports we got. And I always attributed it to people being more empowered to speak up and believing that things just weren't acceptable anymore. And I thought it was great. Not everything we could act on, because I mentioned that these are hard cases, usually he said, she says, and we usually need a little bit more evidence than a he said, she said. But there were a lot of things that I think probably were not reported pre 2014, plus or minus, that were reported after that. I'm not sure the exact date of the Me Too movement, but there was an explosion of call outs. And before I retired, I would say we were probably getting a report once every couple weeks that we would respond to. And again, I never changed from the belief. And I ended up as the supervisor of the squad. And one of my rules is if there's a sex assault on a plane that we knew about, try to get there and do the interviews in person, because you always got better interviews done in person than you did knocking at someone's house 2 weeks later or a month later. So yes, there was a massive explosion of calls. And one of the things that I should share with you is maybe 6 years ago, Congress got involved. This is post Me Too, where people like your friend were talking about, hey, this is unacceptable. It happened on a plane. And Congress was asking the Department of Transportation, well, how common is this? And the Department of Transportation's answer was, yeah, we don't know. I mean, we got some complaints from people, but maybe you should ask the FBI, because they're the ones doing the investigations. And the FBI's general answer, and I know because they asked me, headquarters got the referral, and I was one of the people they asked. And I'm like, well, I think it's a lot more common than we think because most people don't report it. But also, the FBI's own internal records keeping wasn't really designed to track sexual assaults on planes. As you know, we have these classifications for cases, and there wasn't really anything to put sex assaults on planes in a specific category. It was lumped in with this generic crimes on a plane category. So it was very difficult over the course of years to pull out, this is a sex assault, this is a sex assault, this is a theft. It was hard to do. One of the things the FBI did was they created a new violation to specifically focus in on sexual assault calls so we could track them better. And then there was a national task force called the National In-Flight Sexual Misconduct Task Force. And it brought in airlines and federal agencies and trade groups and things like that to talk about the problem and try to come up with some solutions. And they had a person from FBI headquarters as the official point of contact. They also brought me in as a subject matter expert, which was very, very fulfilling. I got to talk about things that I had seen. One of the best things about that task force to me was that they were able to better define sexual misconduct on a plane. And I have the definition here because before then it was like, hey, is it a felony or not? But the definition of sexual misconduct they came up with was this. I'm going to read it verbatim if you don't mind. Sexual misconduct is a broad term. It encompasses any behavior or attempted behavior of a sexual nature that is committed without consent or with someone incapable of consent or by force, intimidation, coercion, or manipulation. Sexual misconduct also includes physical or verbal advances or harassment of a sexual nature or public indecent exposure. And Jerry, as you know, the asking someone if they want to join the Mile High Club is not a violation we can enforce. There's no law for that. But what we found is that there were a lot of times in the post-Me Too movement where We saw this cake I was talking about. We saw the ingredients coming together where there would maybe talk of a sexual nature, or do you have a boyfriend, or they switch seats. Can I sit next to you? Or there's a blanket that goes over someone, or there's that feeling out contact of rubbing up against a knee or touching an arm, where someone actually stopped it and left and told a flight attendant or told them, stop doing that, and then reported it. Where, from my perspective, I could see the cake ingredients coming together, but they didn't bake the cake because someone had intervened.
Which is a good thing. We don't want
It's a
someone to
great thing.
have to go through, this trauma.
You have no idea how many times I told someone, it's like, look, I'm not discounting what you said and what happened because it's important, but I'm so glad you stopped it when you did and it didn't become worse. Because that's a true statement. But from my perspective, there still might be that simple assault. So a lot of people we actually charged with assault, where you had an unwanted contact with someone. And we gave them a court date and things were processed a different way than the felony. We had a number of felony cases go through the process in the post-Me Too movement. But that sexual misconduct definition, I will add that not only did we see this sexual contact between two people, we also had public exposure or indecent exposure, people coming out of the bathroom topless or bottomless. It was crazy stuff on airplanes. That might be another entire podcast for you, Jerry. Crazy stuff Dave has seen on an airplane. We also had people masturbating on board, which is another podcast for you. All these things sort of encompass sexual misconduct. But part two of your question really is, what can you do about it? And number one is, I don't want this to be like a stranger danger episode. Not everyone is trying to do something sexually inappropriate on a plane. At the end of the day, the seats are tight. There is probably going to be inadvertent contact between people. But if you believe something is wrong or it might be wrong, don't give someone the benefit of the doubt. Say something like, hello, that's my armrest, or hey, do you need something? I know you touched me here. Was it on purpose? Or tell a flight attendant if you're not capable or not comfortable with a direct confrontation. Just leave your seat and talk to a flight attendant. Ask them if you can switch seats. A lot of people in the post-Me Too movement have done that, and that really stops things where they start. I will also say that a lot of times on a plane, you don't necessarily know who you're sitting next to. There's this tendency to overshare. This is where I'm going. I don't have a boyfriend. Hey, by the way, I'm going to take a sleeping pill and get drunk because I don't want to be awake for the next 9 hours for this international flight. Don't tell people that, because we have had occasions where people take advantage because they know. It's not like, oh, I have to touch them to see if they're going to wake. They know someone took an Ambien and is going to be out. Like, we've had people wake up from that, like have their bra undone or their underpants out. My recommendation to people is, number one, if you are going to sleep on a plane, try to sleep naturally. Or if you do need some sort of pill, don't telegraph what you're doing to people you're sitting next to, because you may not know who they are and they may not be great people. I would also encourage people to always have the armrest down between you. And even if someone puts it up, put it back down. It's always better to sit in an aisle seat versus a window seat in this type of situation. We've had people feel trapped in a middle or window seat that they didn't feel they could escape or get out of the way. Not to say that you always have to be in a seat like that, but these are all these little things that you might want to consider before you get on a plane. Sometimes it's better to sit next to maybe same-sex people, but even there, in my time, we've investigated male versus female, which is the most common, but also male versus male, female versus male, female versus female. We've seen just about everything at one time or another. So even there, the odds are in your favor if you try to pick who you sit next to, but it doesn't make it zero, because you never know, again, who you're sitting next to. I'd say the vast majority of cases like this has a male suspect and a female victim. It's probably 85%, 90% of the cases we have. It's not a guarantee.
But how much of this is the responsibility of the airlines? If you were in a situation where you felt uncomfortable, that you felt somebody was touching you, and you requested to have your seat moved, the plane's full, and the airline responds they can't do anything. What's the best action to take in that situation?
Number one, most airlines are really, really good about moving people around when they get a complaint like this. Most of the flight attendants are trained. Job number one is to de-escalate. And in this case, the best way to de-escalate is to move someone. A lot of times on a plane, it's not quite full. There's a couple of deadheading flight attendants or someone like that, or maybe an airline employee. Those are generally the first people asked to move to change seats. Sometimes there's law enforcement like you and I on board the plane who might be able to move seats. Even on a very full flight, usually the flight attendants go out of their way to try to defuse by asking different people to move. And most times they can find someone willing to move. There were a couple times when that did not happen, where the airlines, I thought, could have done a better job. One time in particular where I was talking to a flight attendant and she just like, yeah, I didn't really believe her. So I just made her go back and sit in her seat. And I'm like, oh my God. That is the exception versus the rule. The rule is the flight attendants want to de-escalate and they'll do a lot to try to accommodate if you want to move seats. And not like, hey, I want a better seat. It's, hey, this guy's or gal or whatever is creepy. I don't feel comfortable. I need to move. Most airlines, most situations, they do actually do a good job in moving people around. I will say that also, if that happens and they don't move you, stay awake. We talked about blankets moving over people. One of the things you could do if you do have a blanket is tuck it in under you so they can't reach their hand underneath the blanket, or tuck it in under you, put a blanket like a pillow between the two of you so there's less ability to touch. These are all things you might want to do.
It's just horrifying to think that you're in that situation and someone won't even give you the benefit of the doubt to move your seat.
It's rare. It's happened, but it's rare. Again, the vast majority of flight attendants do a great job with this type of thing. There are occasions where this happens and the flight crew will come up to someone and say, hey, do you want law enforcement to meet the plane? Do you want to talk to them? And sometimes there's a no. No, I don't. I have a connecting flight. I have other things to do. That's fine.
I can understand if someone is placed in that situation, they're on a flight, they finally landed, they're home, and they have to make that decision. Do I report this or just bottle it up and get the hell out of here and get home? Now, that's a decision that each victim has to make. What would you say to them about the reasons they should consider reporting something like this?
Well, before I told them that, I think you're absolutely right in that it's a personal decision, right? Not everyone is up to this or wants to do it. And so I think everyone has to make that decision on their own. But if you decide to report it, it's important for me to do the best investigation possible because we don't know if this person's a predator. We don't know if this person's done it other times. We don't know if this person will do it other times. So it's important for us to do that investigation, given the ability to learn who they are, to document what happened, to make sure there's a record of your statement and your truth, and to do the best job we can of an investigation. So to your point, not everyone is comfortable speaking up or being interviewed. And I would say that if you're not comfortable at the doors of the plane or at the airport, it's not the end. The Bureau has a 24-hour line. You can come back. You can talk to the airline. There's ways to do it later on. We've had a lot of people leave the airport because they just wanted to be done. And then they talk to someone they trust. They talk to a parent or a spouse, whomever. And that person says, you should really report this. Don't think it's ever too late to report something. You can report it after the fact. From my perspective, it's harder to investigate, but we will still reach out and do the best job we can. Well, I say we, I'm not there anymore. So the Bureau has a good history of taking these seriously. So I would encourage your listeners to, number one, report, because again, we don't know who the suspect is and we don't know if this is part of a pattern. But also, if you don't feel comfortable reporting it first, there are avenues that you can go to report after the fact. If you change your mind, anyone listening to this podcast, if this has happened or if this happens in the future, hopefully it doesn't, but if it does, if it happens, you can always make a phone call to the FBI's 24/7 phone number and say what happened and make a report. Just because the plane lands and you say nothing doesn't mean it's over. you should always feel free to make a report with the FBI if something like this happens, or with the airline or whomever.
I think that's encouraging because the thing is, even if it doesn't go further than that initial complaint, you still put the person on notice that their behavior was unacceptable. So they can't fool themselves into thinking that you were okay with it and what they're doing is okay.
Well, in both of the cases we talked about today, number one, the suspect's arguments were that, well, they didn't say no. They didn't say anything to indicate that they didn't want it. So by looking at them and making sure that people know there's boundaries, this is my seat, this is your seat, it's those little things that let people know that, no, it's not okay. And that's important. Being willing and able to speak up to make sure people know what you want or don't want, whether it's to the person directly or to the flight attendant, is very, very important.
Excellent. I think that's very, very helpful. One of the things I want to stress to everyone is that we've had an opportunity to speak with you, one of the FBI's experts in crimes on board an aircraft. The FBI even had you do a PSA, public service announcement about sexual misconduct on an airplane. And so I'm going to have a link to that PSA in the show notes for this episode for anybody who wants to look at it to get tips about what to do and how to proceed if something like this was to happen to you or to someone that you know. This is a violation that I think a lot of people didn't know a lot about. And we're very curious. And I thought it would be great for me to try to turn this episode around quickly in order to get it out just before the holiday travel. When people are drinking and in great moods, I would assume that alcohol a lot of times has something to do with these types of crimes.
Well, it's funny you say that because I did a lot of public speaking for the Bureau, and I used to have a slide about two things that are present in almost every crime on a plane. And it was a bottle of whiskey and a bottle of prescription pills. Over and over, people would use alcohol and some sort of pill. And that is pretty much a prescription for a problem on an airplane.
So I'm glad to be able to get this out, but we're going to have you come back because, again, you talked about all the different violations. And, we mentioned how having an office at an airport like LAX is like a microcosm of everything that the FBI does. So we're going to have you come back and we're going to talk about the terrorism angle and specifically about a case where it involved a shooter at the Los Angeles airport.
That'd be great. Thank you.
All right, but we're at the point of the episode where I like to get to know a little bit more about you. I'm going to ask you my standard questions. When and why did you join the FBI?
Well, I was a post 9/11 hire. I applied in the summer of 2002. And at the time, I was working for the U.S. Customs Service. I was a supervisor over the drug and terrorism units. And in that role, it was sort of like the A team. And in that role, I was working with the FBI almost daily, tracking people down and searching them as they came in the country. And one day, I was talking to the FBI agents. I thought, you know what? I could do that job. And that night, I went home and applied online. And turns out I can do that job.
And what was the difference between what you were doing at Customs and what was going to be offered to you, which we know you didn't really get to take advantage of in the FBI?
Well, my sort of sarcastic joke was I jumped ship from Customs to the FBI. They stuck me right back at the airport, but at a lower pay grade. But the difference between the two is that in Customs, you're limited to what the person says and what they have in front of them, what's in their luggage, what's on their body. And it's sort of like an investigation from like A to D or A to E. And the FBI, it's A to Z or beyond. It's everything. So it's a much more fuller investigation. It's more fulfilling to be able to take it all the way. And that's what really inspired me to join the FBI, is that I had an opportunity to really make a difference, to be more of an investigator than just like a very much a snapshot in time investigator at Customs. This is your luggage. This is what you said, versus the Bureau. Let's do search warrants and surveil you and interview you and do all these other things. That's pretty much why I applied. And I can remember It took about 9 months for me to get through the process and into the Bureau. And I can remember my first day in the academy. It was Easter Sunday of 2003. A lot of people had taken a year and a half, 2 years, because it takes a long time. And I thought 9 months was a long time. But one thing about the application process for the people who are listening, who've applied, who are thinking about applying, every time I went to something, phase 1, phase 2, interviews, polygraph, it didn't matter. Every time I went to something, I walked away thinking, well, that's the last time I'll ever hear from those guys. And they just kept calling me back. So eventually they called me and said, hey, the job's yours if you want it. We got an opening in a week and a half in Quantico. Do you want the job? And I said, well, can I think about it? And they said, no, give us an answer now. You've had 9 months. And I said, okay, I'll take it. And the rest is history.
So you stepped down from a supervisory position with customs and started all over again, but ended up again in a supervisory position before you retired.
It actually got worse than that, because when I got the call to join the Bureau, the next call I made was to my chief inspector at LAX for customs. And he's like, we've been trying to reach you all morning. You just got promoted to chief. Congrats. And I said, well, I'm calling to resign. So, yeah.
I guess you're starting to second guess yourself at that time.
And I think, like your first week at the academy, there's a lot of second guessing that goes on. It's like, what was I thinking? But I stuck with it, and I'm glad I did. It was a career like no other, for sure.
Absolutely. All right. So you've only been out for a few months. As everybody knows who listens to this podcast, the FBI agents do retirement wrong. We don't know what retirement means. And so we all look for really second, third, fourth career opportunities post FBI. So have you made any decisions about what adventure you're going to do next?
Well, I took a week off for retirement. It was the first time since December of 1990 that I was unemployed. 1 week off, and then I started a new job. And in getting permission from my new employer to do this podcast, they gave me permission, but they were a little bit gun shy on me talking about them. So I will say I am employed, and I'm working for an organization where I still get to investigate and to really have ethics and integrity at the absolute forefront of what I'm doing. It's weird post-Bureau, as you know, but I'm enjoying what I'm doing.
Do you still get to hang out at the airport?
I have not been back since I left. However, my team calls me here and there, not really for advice on stuff, but just to say hi. There have been a couple times when people have hit me up just to ask what I would do in a certain situation. I've been invited to their Christmas party next month, which I'm excited about doing. I want to give them a little bit of space to be themselves. I feel really, really good about the team that we had at the airport and who they are. And I know that they're doing right by God and country every single day out there. So I'm here if they need me, but in reality, I'm more of a supporter. And the contact I have had with them has been more of a personal, friendly contact. And that makes me happy to be able to have, actual contacts and friends now that I'm not in the Bureau anymore.
Yeah, it means a lot to me too, to be able to do the work that I'm doing and have the opportunity to meet and talk to so many agents from around the country doing so many wonderful things. So I get it. I definitely get it. I love to give my guests the last word. So what would you like to say?
I think for me, being where I was and doing so much public speaking, a lot of times people would come up to me and ask about politics or the Bureau in society. And they'd ask, well, either positive or negative. And I would always tell them the same thing, which was, to be honest with you, politics never affected me because the laws don't change. I'm here to enforce federal laws. And a lot of times I didn't know political affiliations of my coworkers. It's just we're working together to do what's right for the United States, to do what's right for victims of crimes at or on airplanes. And we didn't really think about all these outside forces. So I think my last word to your listeners is that the Bureau really does do a lot of work to do what's right for the United States. And I really think the Bureau is an excellent organization. Can't say enough positive things about my time there. And I really believe that the career I had was one where I made a difference on behalf of the American people.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find photos of retired agent David Gates and links to articles and court documents about the cases he reviewed. There are also links to more information about how the FBI investigates sexual assault violations committed on airplanes, and to an FBI retired case file review episode featuring another crimes on aircraft investigation. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.